The emergency summons reached the Hall of Accord at an hour so sacred that no session had been called during it in over 8,000 cycles. And that was the first detail that made Supreme Archivist Tail understand something had gone terribly wrong. The second was the silence. Not the formal silence of ceremony, but the strained, unnatural silence of beings who had run out of lies to tell themselves. 42 sovereign banners hung beneath the crystal dome, and under every one of them stood delegates from civilizations that had survived plagues, supernovas, succession wars, machine revolts, and the slow deaths of suns. Yet all of them were staring at the central projection as though it were a grave opening beneath their feet. What filled that projection had once been the frontier fortress ring at Vel Asarin, an orbital defense lattice so massive that entire trade convoys used it as a navigational landmark. Now there was only absence. No debris field. No molten wreckage. No drifting corpses or broken stations. Just a widening black void where billions of tons of alloy, weapons, atmosphere, and life had been stripped so completely from existence that the sensors could not even decide what to call the emptiness left behind. The Fleet Marshal of the 9th Defensive Choir had transmitted his final report 17 minutes before the fortress vanished. His last words were still pinned beneath the image in cold silver text. "We are not fighting an enemy. We are being studied by one." A murmur rolled through the chamber, then died almost immediately when the next image appeared. 3 more fortress worlds had gone dark along the same vector. Then 7 mining systems. Then a civilian corridor. The pattern was not random. That was what made it worse. Whatever was moving through the outer dark was not charging like a beast or expanding like a storm. It was selecting routes, bypassing distractions, and cutting toward the interior of the Union with the ruthless discipline of something that already understood exactly how the galaxy would try to stop it. Every Grand Admiral in the chamber had a different expression of fear, but it was fear all the same. "The iron matrices failed first," said Defense Speaker Oren, and his voice cracked on the last word hard enough to make several delegates flinch. No one had ever heard that species sound uncertain before. Then the crown fleets of Sarad. Then the triune barrier hosts. They all engaged. They all adapted. They all died. No one asked how many ships had been lost. The answer was already in the room like smoke. Too many. Not enough. Entire military philosophies had just been erased in a matter of days, and for the first time in living memory, the elder powers were not arguing over jurisdiction or doctrine or pride. They were arguing over whether there was still time left to beg. That argument ended when the chamber doors opened and an old sealed archive cylinder was carried in by hand. At first, Tail did not understand why every eye in the hall shifted toward that small black container with more dread than they had shown the annihilation of 4 sectors. Then he saw the sigil burned into the metal. Restricted emergency record. Level abyssal. Origin classification. Internal threat assessment. Species designation redacted by order of the First Council. His blood ran cold before he even heard the name. "We should never have hidden it this long," whispered Chancellor Varys, whose people had not spoken a public apology in 3,000 years. "If we had told the truth when the restriction was passed, perhaps we would not be here now." A dozen minds in the room recoiled at once, not from the thing in the dark beyond the frontier, but from the memory of a decision none of their successors had been allowed to question. A ban. An old amendment. A species judged too dangerous for sanctioned war, too unstable for strategic command, too unpredictable to be trusted with legal violence in a civilized galaxy. For generations, that ruling had been spoken of with faint embarrassment, like an overreaction from a more fearful age. Now the oldest powers in creation were staring at the consequence of their own caution and realizing it had not been caution at all. It had been recognized. Tail looked again at the growing black wound spreading across the projection, then at the sealed archive cylinder in the center of the chamber, and finally at the trembling hand of the Chancellor as she entered the release code. When the redaction vanished, the forbidden species name appeared in white. Humanity. And before anyone could speak, the long-range warning net above the capital flashed with a new signal from the frontier. One of the dead systems had just transmitted a message after its destruction. It was not a distress call. It was a countdown. For 11 full seconds after the word humanity appeared above the chamber floor, no one moved. The countdown continued in the corner of the projection with mechanical indifference, white numerals stepping downward toward some unknown consequence. And yet the greater shock in the Hall of Accord came not from the dying frontier but from the file itself. Delegates who had arrived prepared to debate fleet reserves, evacuation corridors, and emergency powers now found themselves staring into a sealed decision made generations earlier by ancestors arrogant enough to believe they could permanently define the limits of one particular species. The chamber had become a place where the past was suddenly more frightening than the future, and that realization spread through the air with a pressure all its own. Supreme Archivist Tail stepped forward before he fully understood why. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the old discipline of his office, the reflex to put order around panic before panic acquired momentum. The archive cylinder had split open into 6 concentric rings of light, and within them hovered the original decision record, stripped at last of its censorship. The date alone was enough to chill him. The prohibition had not been passed after a war, not after a rebellion, not after some atrocity committed by human hands. It had been passed before humanity had ever fielded a legal fleet in interstellar space. They had been feared not for what they had done, but for what the elder powers had concluded they would eventually do if ever given a sanctioned place inside the galaxy's ritualized order of violence. The file did not begin with condemnation. That was what unsettled Tail most. It began with admiration sharpened into alarm. Humanity had entered known space under circumstances that, at the time, seemed almost laughably humble. Their first vessels had looked improvised beside the sculpted splendor of established star nations, all reinforced seams and over-engineered redundancies, as if built by a species that trusted disaster more than elegance. They came from a heavy-gravity world with unstable weather, corrosive oceans, violent tectonics, apex predators in absurd abundance, and ecological systems so competitive that several elder observers had initially classified Earth as a failed biosphere somehow still in progress. The consensus among the major powers had been immediate and smug. Any civilization born there would either be brittle from overcompensation or permanently traumatized by survival. Either way harmless. For a while, the galaxy enjoyed being wrong in small ways. Humans settled marginal planets no one else wanted and then turned them productive within a decade. They took trade lanes considered too volatile for civilian use and somehow made them profitable. They sent expeditionary engineers into radiation belts, fungal wastelands, cryo-deserts, and gravity wells with the casual energy of people volunteering for overtime. Whenever asked why they kept choosing hardship, humans never answered with pride. That would have made sense. They answered with baffling practicality, as though discomfort were not a warning sign but merely another variable to be managed. The old record included dozens of ambassadorial complaints that were almost comical in hindsight. Humans did not respect sensible environmental thresholds. Humans normalized risk to unhealthy degrees. Humans laughed at infrastructure guidelines written to protect more fragile species. One complaint, written by an outraged colonial inspector from the House of Sarid, stated that a human survey team had described hurricane-force seasonal storms as good turbine weather. Even then, that would not have justified the ban. Endurance was respected. Ingenuity was admired. The galaxy had room for difficult species. What changed the conversation was not what humans survived, but how they analyzed conflict. Tail scrolled deeper through the declassified findings as the chamber watched over his shoulder. Long before the prohibition, humanity had been invited to observe several regulated engagements between rival powers, a gesture of courtesy extended to new civilizations so they could learn the customs of lawful warfare. Those customs formed one of the foundations of galactic stability. War in civilized space was constrained by location, timing, scale, and declared objective. There were zones, witnesses, surrender protocols, weapons limitations, extraction guarantees, lineage protections, and mandatory pauses for arbitration. The elders called it refinement. The species of the Union called it wisdom. Humanity had sat in the observation galleries, studied the battles, thanked their hosts, and then asked questions that caused entire advisory councils to go quiet. Why announce doctrine beforehand? Why preserve patterns once the enemy has learned them? Why is victory measured by honorable compliance rather than future threat removal? Why would any species stop after winning a battle if stopping allows the threat to learn, recover, and return later under different conditions? The questions had been logged as cultural naivety at first. Then came the strategic exercises. As part of integration, new members were periodically invited to participate in predictive war simulations against archived scenarios. It was a harmless academic ritual, a way to compare instincts across civilizations. Human delegates performed poorly in the early rounds because they ignored accepted doctrine, violated assumptions, and repeatedly proposed maneuvers that would have triggered immediate censure in real military courts. Then the exercise supervisors changed the scoring matrix. Instead of honoring doctrinal compliance, they ran the same scenarios under one altered instruction: survive at all costs. Humanity's results became impossible to ignore. They did not win the simulations by being stronger. They won by refusing to think inside the moral architecture that every older species treated as universal. They abandoned prestige positions, sacrificed symbolic assets, invited the enemy into false advantages, weaponized logistics, manipulated tempo, and treated predictability itself as a fatal weakness. When scenarios were made adaptive, humans improved faster than the models. When enemy behavior changed, human teams changed sooner. Again and again, their simulations ended the same way, not with a negotiated equilibrium, but with the complete collapse of the opposing force's ability to reconstitute itself. They did not merely defeat opponents. They solved them. A hush descended so deep over the Hall of Accord that even the countdown seemed louder. Tail realized, with sudden and rising unease, that no one in the room was shocked by the old fear anymore. They were shocked by how rational it now seemed. Chancellor Varys finally found her voice. They were banned, she said, each word heavy with inherited shame, because the founders concluded that if humanity ever went to war without restraints, they would not treat conflict as a contest between states. They would treat it as an engineering problem. No one argued. On the central projection, the countdown from the destroyed system fell below 8 minutes. A defense minister from the Triune Barrier hosts stepped into the silence and spoke the question everyone had been avoiding. If they were judged that dangerous before they were powerful, what do we imagine they are now? The answer did not come from the archive. It came from the frontier. A new transmission broke into the hall, this one not automated, not distorted, and not dead. It was a live feed from Observation Relay Kepri 9, one of the last surviving stations on the outer line. The operator's face filled the projection, pale beneath emergency lighting, eyes wide with the kind of terror that strips rank from the voice. Behind him, warning sirens bled through the audio, and beyond the station glass there was movement in the stars where no movement should have been. "We have visuals," he said, breath-catching. "By all living suns, we have visual." The feed rotated outward. Ships were emerging from the dark between systems, not the enemy, but human vessels. They did not arrive in ceremonial formation. They did not broadcast identity fanfares, diplomatic beacons, or legal entry codes. They came in hard, silent geometry, matte black hulls wrapped in engine glare, moving with a predatory confidence that made every warfleet ever assembled by the Union suddenly look ornamental. And as the first of them crossed the relay's sensor grid, a second signal entered the Hall of Accord from the Sol delegation itself. Humanity acknowledged the emergency request. Then, with terrifying calm, they asked for every battle record the galaxy had tried to hide from them. The human request reached the Hall of Accord with none of the pleading softness the Elder Powers had expected and none of the outrage some of them had secretly feared. It was concise, comprehensive, and so clinically specific that Supreme Archivist Tail felt a pressure gather behind his eyes before he had finished reading the first third of it. Humanity did not ask for command authority. They did not ask for apologies. They did not demand repeal of the ancient prohibition, not yet. Instead, they requested raw telemetry from every failed engagement, sensory recordings from every surviving bridge crew, adaptation rate analyses from every military science bureau, civilian evacuation paths, debris field dispersal models, supply collapse projections, biosignature corruption logs, black box fragments, and unedited Death Channel transcripts from ships that had remained alive long enough to describe what they were seeing as they died. It was not a request for history. It was a request for pattern density. Several delegates objected immediately, not because the information was classified anymore, but because the shape of the request itself made them uneasy. Human analysts were not asking who had fought bravely, which admirals had blundered, or where the next defensive wall could be raised. They were asking for inputs, failure behaviors, learning intervals, and terminal response windows. The vocabulary was warlike only by implication. In structure, it sounded like medicine, engineering, systems theory, and predation stitched into a single language no elder strategist had ever quite trusted. Tail watched the debate ignite and understood, with a fresh wave of discomfort, that the panic in the room had already begun transforming. At first, the hull of Accord had feared the devouring force moving in from the outer dark. Now part of it feared what kind of mind might truly be able to stop it. The objections ended when the next live feed arrived. Observation Relay Kepri 9 had not survived long enough to send a proper report. The station's main tower was peeled open in silence by something that moved too quickly for the eye to follow and too intelligently for anyone to call it random destruction. But just before the feed cut to static, the operator had managed to lock one external camera onto the battlefield unfolding beyond the relay's orbital shadow. The footage was unstable, its light broken by plasma interference and shock distortion, yet one truth emerged from the chaos with brutal clarity. The human vessels had not approached the advancing dark mass as diplomats, rescuers, or honored allies entering a common fight. They had approached like beings who had accepted the existence of a problem and moved immediately to the first stage of solving it. What the galaxy had first mistaken for silence from the human fleet was not hesitation. It was an observation under motion. The black hulls cut laterally across the enemy's advance path without forming any recognized battle line. They did not align by class or rank. They did not mirror one another. Smaller ships surged ahead and then peeled away at impossible angles, seeding the void with bursts of reflective particulate clouds that interfered with long-range scans. Larger carriers held back just beyond the first wave, releasing dense strings of autonomous objects that looked, to conquered eyes, almost indecently crude. No gleaming ceremonial drones. No elegant lattice constructs. Just blunt machines launched in ugly volume and positioned with ruthless precision. Then the first firing patterns began, and every military observer in the hull felt their assumptions fracture. Humans did not test the enemy's armor with the most powerful weapons first. They began with noise. Broad-spectrum energy lashings came in overlapping bands from rotating vectors, not concentrated enough to kill, but structured enough to force reaction. Heat spikes. Frequency bursts. Impact pacing. Deliberate inconsistency. To the older powers, it looked wasteful, even amateur, until the telemetry overlay from the station translated what was happening on the sensor level. The incoming devouring structures were changing under pressure, redistributing surface composition, rerouting internal mass flow, and adjusting their own shield analogs in response to each stimulus. Humanity was not attacking for destruction. Humanity was provoking diagnosis. Tail felt his throat tighten as realization spread through the chamber in ripples. The species that had been outlawed from war had entered first contact with the galaxy's greatest predator and decided, within minutes, to study how it learned before choosing how to hurt it. Defense Speaker Oren broke the silence first. Their mapping adaptation. No one contradicted him because no one could. The human fleet had not committed fully, had not revealed its heavier batteries, and had not attempted a rescue of the station despite its visible civilian complement. That last detail struck the hull like a moral wound. A Sarid delegate rose half out of her seat and demanded to know why the humans were withholding force while living beings still remained aboard Kepri 9. Before Tail could answer, before anyone could soften the cruelty of the truth, the station itself answered for them. A secondary blast tore through the relay's habitat spine, and the civilian signatures vanished from the lower left quadrant of the tactical display. The human ships did not alter course. The chamber erupted. Some called it barbarism. Some called it necessary. Some fell into stunned silence because the implications were too sharp to hold at once. Human commanders had entered a live massacre, recognized that they did not yet understand the enemy, and made the decision every elder power had spent millennia training itself never to make. They had chosen the wider survival equation over the immediate visible tragedy. Not because they felt nothing, Tail sensed that with disturbing certainty, but because they had placed the future cost of ignorance above the political comfort of a noble gesture. And if they were willing to do that at the opening edge of contact, what else were they willing to do once they truly engaged? The answer, or part of it, arrived from the Sol delegation 15 minutes later. A single human appeared on the chamber projection, not in ceremonial robes, not in a military uniform heavy with metal architecture, but in a dark field jacket marked only by a narrow insignia at the collar. She looked older than most of the species represented in the room and were willing to allow their public leaders to appear, with silver threaded through her hair and a stillness in her face that made the surrounding panic seem juvenile. When she spoke, her voice carried no dramatic force. That made it hit harder. "I am Director Ilara Voss of the Strategic Preservation Authority," she said. "Your data transfer has begun. Our first assessment confirms that your fleets have not been losing because the threat is stronger than you. You have been losing because you keep teaching it the same lesson." No one interrupted. The room had gone too still. Voss turned slightly as if reading from a stream of analysis not visible to anyone else. "Your doctrines announce priorities through formation logic, preserve valuable assets too early, retreat along mathematically predictable corridors, and rely on centralized adaptation windows that remain legible under stress. The hostile intelligence is not merely enduring your force. It is training on your habits. You have transformed your military traditions into a language, and it has become fluent." There was outrage on some faces, shame on others, but beneath both lay something more dangerous: recognition. Tail had spent his life preserving the records of civilizations that called themselves ancient because they had lasted. In that moment he saw, perhaps for the first time, the rot beneath their pride. They had mistaken continuity for superiority. Their wars had become so ritualized, so bound by inherited geometry and inherited meaning, that even their improvisation had begun to look the same every century. Humanity, by contrast, was speaking as if doctrine were not sacred memory but disposable scaffolding. A military prefect from the Iron Matrices finally found the courage to ask the only useful question: "Can it be stopped?" Director Voss did not answer immediately. That pause was worse than any speech. Her gaze shifted downward for a moment, as though she were reading casualty projections no one else in the chamber would have been able to survive seeing in raw form. When she looked up again, the calm in her expression had not changed, but something colder had entered it. "Yes," she said at last. "But not by fighting the war you want. Only by fighting one cannot survive." The statement struck the hall like a pressure wave. Several delegates began speaking at once, but Voss raised one hand with such effortless authority that the noise thinned without her needing to demand it. "We are dispatching advisory teams to your surviving command centers," she continued. "Before broader intervention is considered, we require unrestricted access to every uncensored record of prior engagements, authority to review civil defense priorities without committee delay, and confirmation that no active commander will conceal losses, falsify readiness, or preserve ceremonial doctrine at the expense of adaptation speed. If your answer to any of those conditions is no, then you are not asking us to help you win. You are asking us to die inside your habits." She ended the transmission before anyone could respond. The reaction in the Hall of Accord was not unified. The fracture was made public. Some delegates were furious at the tone. Some were too shaken to speak. A few, the oldest and most exhausted among them, wore expressions that bordered on relief, as though someone had finally named the disease that had been killing them. Tail stood near the central projection and looked up at the suspended tactical map of the frontier. Another 3 systems had dimmed while Director Voss was speaking. The countdown from the dead relay had fallen silent. No one yet knew what would happen when it reached 0, or whether something had already begun somewhere deeper inside Union space. Chancellor Varys turned toward Tail so abruptly that her ceremonial chains snapped against one another. How long ago? She asked, and there was no pride left in her voice at all. Did they start thinking like this? Tail looked down at the declassified archive still turning slowly in the air between them. Past the simulation records and advisory notes, past the integration transcripts and cultural flags, another sealed layer had surfaced at the bottom of the file now that the first redactions were gone. It had not been opened yet. It bore an internal human date stamp from decades before first contact and a title so brief that it made his skin prickle. Contingency Model, Exterior Predatory Intelligence. He looked back at the dying frontier, then at the unopened layer of the file, and understood that the most terrifying possibility in the room was no longer that humanity might fail. It was that humanity might have seen this coming long before the galaxy ever learned to fear it. By the time the emergency convoys began carrying human advisory teams into the surviving inner defense sectors, the political center of the Union had already started to split along a line no one had expected to see in public. It was not the old divide between hawks and diplomats, nor between elder powers and lesser members, nor even between those who wanted immediate retaliation and those who still clung to evacuation doctrine. The new fracture was simpler and far more humiliating. There were those who believed survival now required surrendering strategic control to humanity, and those who would rather lose worlds than place the fate of civilization in the hands of a species their ancestors had once deemed too dangerous to trust with lawful war. Under ordinary circumstances, that argument might have stretched for months, hidden behind procedure and committee language. But ordinary circumstances had already died at the frontier. While the debate raged, 6 more systems went dark. Supreme Archivist Tail watched that fracture widen from a command gallery overlooking the Hall of Accord's secondary operations chamber, where crisis governance had replaced ceremony so completely that even the chamber's luminous banners had been dimmed to save power for tactical projection. There were no speeches anymore, only interruptions. No one stood when addressing the assembly. No one asked permission before cutting across another voice. Reports flooded every wall. Refugee columns. Fuel deficits, biosignature loss clouds, hyperlane contamination, civilian mutinies on transport stations that had received evacuation priority too late. Yet through that chaos, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Human teams arriving at command nodes were not behaving like junior consultants attached to a foreign war effort. They were moving like surgeons stepping into an operating room already full of people who had mistaken ritual for treatment. The first scandal broke on the fortress world of Iller Gate. Its command staff had spent 2 days assuring the Hall that its layered defense shell remained fully combat capable, that ammunition reserves were stable, and that morale among the barrier crews was firm. Then a human audit cell reached the planet, tore through the records in less than 3 hours, and exposed a truth so appalling that even battle-hardened delegates fell silent when the findings were transmitted. The fortress had been preserving its central ceremonial fleet in pristine reserve for a decisive engagement that no longer existed. Entire strike wings had been held back to protect symbols of continuity, while outer civilian districts were left underscreened and transport lanes remained exposed because local commanders feared the political shame of visibly committing their final honorable assets too early. The human report did not insult them. It did something worse. It quantified the consequences of their pride down to the projected number of children who would die if tradition remained in command for another 14 hours. The governor of Iller Gate protested in outrage and accused humanity of cultural vandalism. The response from the human audit lead arrived as a single sentence entered into the public record. Any doctrine that values the image of order above the survival of the living is not culture. It is vanity under pressure. The statement spread across Union channels with the speed of scandal and the force of revelation. Some species were appalled by the arrogance. Others were privately shaken because they knew, all at once, that the accusation applied to them too. It became harder and harder for older admirals to pretend that human intervention was merely technical. Humans were not just critiquing deployment patterns or warning against predictable retreat vectors. They were stripping sacred assumptions out of command architecture and asking whether those assumptions had ever truly served survival at all. That question became even more dangerous when the human ships already operating near the frontier sent back their first deep strategic assessment. The enemy was not simply advancing. It was selected for obedience. At first Tail did not understand what that meant. Then Director Elara Voss appeared again over secure projection, standing inside a room so dim and crowded with shifting data that her face seemed carved out of motion. Behind her, translucent maps rotated through impossible densities of movement, each threaded with red vectors that converged and diverged faster than older tactical AIs could normally display. She did not greet the chamber. She began as if resuming a conversation civilization itself had interrupted too long ago. The hostile intelligence is prioritizing systems whose military response remains highly centralized, she said. It is striking worlds whose command structures require confirmation rituals, doctrinal consensus, symbolic asset preservation, or delayed authorization chains before adaptation can occur. It is not merely consuming material. It is feeding on strategic latency. A cold silence met that analysis because everyone in the chamber understood its implication. The enemy had not only learned their tactics. It had learned their bureaucracy. Voss continued without pause. We also assess with high confidence that it is now weighting human contact as a new variable. Our initial disruption at Kepri 9 forced an adjustment. That adjustment occurred faster than projected. Which means two things. First, it can prioritize novelty under pressure. Second, it will soon begin searching for the logic underneath our variability. A defense minister from the Triune Barrier hosts leaned forward so abruptly that his station flashed a balance warning. Then you are already losing the advantage. No, Voss said, and her voice remained calm enough to make the word feel sharpened. We are reaching the end of the first one. That sentence moved through the chamber like a chill. Tail understood then what had unsettled him from the beginning. Every elder power in the Union still thought in terms of battle plans, campaigns, defensive lines, and recoverable setbacks. Humanity was speaking in layers, as if strategy itself were something nested, disposable, and continuously rebuilt. One advantage ending did not mean defeat. It meant transition. To species raised on inherited doctrine, the idea was almost indecent. To humans, it appeared to be baseline thought. But not all resistance to humanity came from fear. Some came from memory. When the old prohibition file was fully reopened under emergency authority, its remaining contents spilled into the classified channels of the hull with devastating effect. There were simulation records far beyond anything Tail had yet seen, comparative studies of species-level response behaviors, and one hidden memorandum from the original founders of the ban. That memorandum was not hysterical. It was careful, thorough, and utterly damning. The elders had not feared that humanity would become violent for pleasure, conquest, or glory. They had feared something much stranger. Humans, under existential threat, showed a repeated tendency to shed inherited frameworks faster than any known species while maintaining social cohesion long enough to weaponize improvisation. In plain terms, they did not collapse when rules failed. They accelerated. For a moment Tail felt almost physically ill. Everything the Union had called civilization for ages beyond counting had depended on the assumption that under pressure, everyone wanted fewer possibilities. Humans, the file warned, became more dangerous because pressure expanded the number of possibilities they were willing to consider. That same hour, the request everyone had been avoiding finally came. Humanity demanded the formal suspension of all ceremonial warfare codes across the threatened sectors, immediate dissolution of symbolic reserve protections, and provisional authority to restructure defense governance planet by planet wherever delay patterns matched projected collapse models. The chamber erupted on impact. Some called it occupation by legal disguise. Some called it blackmail at the edge of extinction. Some demanded repeal of the ancient anti-human restriction before any such transfer could even be discussed, while others recoiled at the idea that repealing it now might mean admitting their ancestors had been right to fear this species all along. Tail listened to the fury until it became meaningless noise. On the central map, 3 refugee routes had just folded into red. A moon station with 80 million civilians aboard had lost contact. And beyond every argument in the room loomed the deeper terror none of them wished to name aloud. Humanity was not asking for trust. Humanity was asking whether the galaxy wanted survival more than it wanted dignity. Then the chamber doors opened again. This time, it was not a projection. 3 human officers walked into the Hall of Accord in person, unarmed, expressionless, and wearing field black with no ceremonial markings at all, as if they had no interest in looking impressive before the species that had once forbidden them from war. The tallest of them placed a sealed transit case on the central table and activated its lock. Inside was not a weapon. It was a map of the Union, layered with hidden infrastructure signatures buried beneath trade routes, freight depots, research corridors, civilian logistics webs, and dormant shipyard shells stretching farther than anyone in the chamber believed humanity should have been capable of building unnoticed. And as the first hidden fleet markers came alive across the stars, Tail realized with a pulse of awe edged in dread that humanity had obeyed the law exactly long enough to prepare for the day the law would fail. The Hall of Accord did not reach unanimity because unanimity belonged to calmer ages. What it reached, after 6 hours of accusation, silence, fear, and collapsing casualty forecasts, was something far more revealing. Surrender. Not of sovereignty in the formal sense, because too many species still needed the comfort of titles and votes and preserved dignity, but surrender of the one thing that mattered now. Delay. The ceremonial warfare codes across the threatened sectors were suspended under emergency survival authority, symbolic reserve protections were dissolved, and a provisional strategic mandate was granted to human command in every system projected to fall within the next 12 days. The old restriction against humanity remained technically unrepealed, still hanging in the legal architecture like a ghost no one wanted to confront directly, but functionally the galaxy had already crossed the line its ancestors had feared. It had placed its survival inside human hands and prayed that the fear had been exaggerated. It had not. The first full joint engagement under human direction took place at the Narrows Convergence, where 5 hyperspace corridors narrowed around a dead star and forced any major advance through a compression field dense enough to distort long-range targeting. Every surviving elder strategist agreed it was the perfect defensive anchor. That consensus alone should have warned them something was wrong. Supreme Archivist Tail watched the battle unfold from the command deck of the human flagship Resolute Mercy, where he had been placed not as an honored guest but as an archival observer, a witness from the old order sent to see exactly what the new one intended to do in its place. He had expected discipline. He had expected force. He had not expected the atmosphere of the bridge. Nothing about it resembled the command centers of the Union. It was too loud, too fluid, too alive. Tactical projections bloomed and vanished across overlapping surfaces. Officers challenged assumptions in real time without waiting for permission. Simulations were generated, discarded, and rewritten while weapons crews were already executing the previous plan. There was no sacred stillness around rank. No ritual pauses before decisions. Human authority did not seem weakened by contradiction. It seemed fed by it, sharpened through friction at a pace no elder military culture would have tolerated for a single minute. Tail realized, to his discomfort, that the human bridge did not look less orderly than a Union command center. It looked as though order had been redesigned around motion instead of control. The enemy arrived in splinters first, then in mass. Dark structures spilled out of the corridor sheer like pieces of a broken intelligence rushing to reassemble itself under fire, some blade-thin and fast, others immense and swollen with absorbed matter from dead sectors. Even now they did not move like a fleet. They moved like appetite-given architecture. Human long-range batteries fired at once, but not in the concentrated, overwhelming style every observer expected. The opening barrage was strangely distributed, almost hesitant in its lethality, and for one dangerous instant Tail felt a wave of horror that the old admirals had been right. Humanity, for all its hidden preparation and cold analysis, was about to waste the last viable choke point in the inner Union by being too clever when brute force was needed. Then he began to understand what he was seeing, and the understanding was worse. The first human salvos were not aimed to destroy the largest enemy structures. They were aimed to provoke differentiated responses. Kinetic slugs hammered some targets while polarized plasma cut across others at carefully staggered intervals. Drone clusters seeded the field with false signatures, then detonated into clouds of reactive particulate that changed the battlespace chemistry faster than Union tactical programs could classify it. Missiles were launched not toward the center of mass but toward peripheral vectors that forced the enemy to choose between shielding valuable nodes and preserving movement coherence. Humanity was not attacking the advancing force as a whole. Humanity was breaking it into 1,000 decisions and measuring which decisions it preferred to make under pressure. "Adaptation split is beginning," said one human analyst near tail, not triumphantly, but with the dry focus of a physician watching test results come in. The enemy reacted fast. Faster than even Director Voss's first estimates had predicted. Surface structures densified against kinetics. Energy bleed patterns shifted. Whole clusters of the dark mass sacrificed outer layers to feed shielding changes deeper in the formation. A murmur ran across the human bridge, not panic, not surprise, but recognition. The thing was learning on contact and learning well. "Good," said Admiral Sanaa Vale from the central command ring. She did not raise her voice. She did not grip her station dramatically or issue some grand order for the record. She simply watched the tactical bloom with the stillness of someone seeing an expected doorway open. "Now it has committed to the first interpretation." Tail turned toward her so sharply that one of the bridge officers had to steady his balance brace. The first interpretation. Not the right interpretation. Not the final one. Humanity had entered the largest battle in living memory expecting the enemy to misunderstand them first. What followed shattered every remaining instinct he carried from the old strategic schools. At the exact moment the enemy's adaptation curves stabilized against the opening assault pattern, human formations dissolved. Not retreated. Dissolved. The fleets that had appeared to be building pressure at the Narrows bottleneck broke into jagged, asymmetrical fragments and accelerated outward along vectors no defensive doctrine would ever have permitted inside a contested choke zone. Several Union liaison officers aboard the Resolute Mercy cried out in disbelief, convinced humanity had just broken its own line and handed the corridor to the advancing mass. For 3 terrible seconds, it looked exactly that way. Then concealed acceleration gates ignited across the dead star's magnetosphere. Human vessels reappeared behind the enemy. Not a few. Hundreds. The Narrows defense had never been the real battle line. It had been a diagnostic shell, a visible logic designed to force the hostile intelligence into reading human priorities in exactly the wrong order. While the enemy concentrated adaptation against the assaults it could see, entire strike elements had hidden in the dead star's interference wake, drifting cold and dark until the moment the enemy's internal mass distribution shifted to answer the false problem presented to it. Then those hidden elements struck from the rear with weapons the first wave had not meaningfully used at all. Dense gravitic shear mines. Focused rail volleys. Penetrator swarms built not to crack armor broadly, but to tear through the freshly reconfigured support tissues the enemy had exposed while solving the initial attack. The effect was immediate and grotesque. Dark structures that had been nearly invulnerable minutes earlier began rupturing from within as if the battle space itself had turned traitor. The hostile mass lurched, overcompensated, then split into contradictory reactions across its own body. Some portions hardened. Others scattered. A few turned inward on adjacent clusters, not in confusion exactly, but in resource cannibalization so abrupt that Tail finally understood the real human objective. They were not merely damaging the enemy's matter. They were poisoning the enemy's confidence in its own adaptation cycle. And yet even as awe hit the bridge, a deeper tension rose with it. Because the enemy learned that too. New structures flashed into being along the rearward kill zones, thinner and faster than anything seen at Kepri 9 or the Frontier massacres. They ignored the collapsing main pressure front entirely and lunged toward the hidden human strike groups with a precision that turned admiration to dread in a heartbeat. On every display, the projections were updated red. Casualties spiked. 2 human cruisers vanished in synchronized bursts. A carrier broke in half and kept transmitting for 11 more seconds while its surviving drones continued executing attack orders from a ship that no longer existed. Tail stared at the losses, stunned by how quickly triumph had curdled into something harsher. Humanity had opened the enemy's guard, yes. Humanity had forced it into the first true strategic stumble any civilization had yet witnessed. But in doing so, they had taught it the first lesson no one in the galaxy could afford for it to learn. The thing in the corridor had stopped studying the Union. Now it was studying humans. And as Admiral Vale looked over the casualty streams with an expression that suggested this, too, had already been accounted for, she gave the order that made every blood-cold instinct in Tail's body recoil. "Good," she said quietly. "Release the second deception. Let it think this was the real surprise. I'm carrying the escalation forward and keeping the phase inside the target band while preserving the same tone, continuity, and pressure curve." The second deception did not begin with a new weapon. It began with a mistake, or rather with the appearance of one so convincing that even the human liaison crews aboard the Union command platforms recoiled when they saw it unfold. At Admiral Vale's order, 3 outer strike groups near the Narrows convergence broke formation too late, crossed firing arcs they should have cleared cleanly, and left a narrow seam through which the enemy's fastest splinter bodies surged toward the evacuation spine behind the Dead Star. On every Union tactical display it looked catastrophic, the kind of error that would be taught for centuries as the exact moment discipline failed under pressure. Refugee tugs and hospital barges began flashing distress signatures at once. The enemy had found exposed flesh behind the blade. And it did not hesitate. Tail felt the bridge of the resolute Mercy Titan around that realization like muscle around a wound. The dark splinters ignored the heavier human warships hunting them from the rear and went straight for the civilian corridor with mathematical cruelty. Hundreds of thousands of lives were now moving in slow thermal chains through the convergence, their drives capped for stability, their shields weak, their signatures bright. It was exactly the sort of target every civilized military doctrine in the Union existed to protect first. On half the Allied channels, commanders were already demanding immediate interception and full diversion of human assets. On the human bridge, no one panicked. They simply watched. Then the seam closed behind the splinter advance. What had seemed like a late withdrawal became a folding trap. The strike groups had not blundered across one another's path. They had crossed precisely enough to make the corridor feel discovered rather than granted. The hostile splinters plunged deeper toward the refugees, only to hit layered fields of dormant hunter mines seeded hours earlier along vectors no Union planner had even flagged as tactically useful. Gravitic nets snapped into existence. Mass signatures warped. Dark bodies sheared against one another at impossible angles as the geometry of the corridor turned predatory. For 8 brief minutes the enemy tore itself apart, trying to reach something vulnerable. But by the 9th minute, it changed. Tail saw the shift ripple across the tactical displays before the analysts gave it language. The enemy did not merely adapt its armor this time or alter movement densities or redistribute support tissues under fire. It adapted its judgment. It stopped chasing what looked weak and began targeting what human command had chosen to protect. Decoys lost value. Visible bait lost value. Even sacrificial asymmetry lost value. The hostile intelligence had learned the contour beneath the variation. It was no longer studying human tactics. It was studying human preference. Director Voss appeared on a side projection without fanfare, her face cut hard by the light of live casualty streams. "It is building a behavioral model," she said. "Not of our weapons. Of our priorities." A dozen officers spoke at once, but Admiral Vale silenced them with a glance. Tail barely heard the bridge anymore. His attention was trapped by the implications spilling through Voss's words. The Union had lost worlds because its wars had become a ritual language. Humanity had broken that language and survived the first exchange by becoming unreadable. Now the enemy was doing something worse than countering weapons. It was using pain as a sensor. It was watching what humans saved first, what they refused to abandon, which losses altered command tempo, and where grief produced structural predictability. For the first time since the hidden fleets emerged, Tail felt a new species of terror rise inside him. The thing they were fighting was beginning to understand the difference between human flexibility and human conscience. The pressure intensified everywhere at once. 3 inner systems triggered civilian collapse alarms within the same hour. At Pelea Reach, Local governors refused a human evacuation rewrite because it required abandoning a heritage station that had stood for 11,000 years. 90 minutes later, the station was gone and its debris field poisoned 2 adjacent lanes. At Vacas, a Union admiral concealed the true fuel state of his reserve flotillas to avoid public disgrace and lost them trapped in docking rings before human advisors could force launch authority through. Each failure fed the same conclusion with unbearable clarity. This war was not being lost only at the frontier or in great fleet actions. It was being lost inside pride, delay, symbolism, and the ancient addiction to appearances. Humanity was fighting the enemy. Humanity was also fighting the habits of the galaxy itself. That truth detonated across public space when the old anti-human report leaked. No one ever discovered whether the release came from panic, conscience, or human calculation, only that within minutes every major civilian channel in the Union carried the key passages once buried beneath abyssal seals. The words were clinical, almost bloodless, and therefore impossible to dismiss. Humanity, the report warned, did not treat conflict as bounded competition. Humanity treated existential threat as a solvable condition and showed repeated willingness to discard inherited limits once those limits obstructed survival. Across worlds already trembling on the edge of annihilation, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some populations demanded full human control at any cost. Others erupted in riots, terrified that saving the Union might simply replace one nightmare with another. On 3 core stations, anti-human violence broke out before local security realized the mobs were attacking the only analysts capable of keeping their evacuation corridors alive. Tail watched it happen in fragments across the bridge feeds, and the shock of it hollowed him more than any battlefield image. The galaxy was dying, and still it had found time to fear the species trying to save it. Yet what unsettled him most was not the fear itself. It was that the humans did not seem surprised by it. They had expected this too. Some officers looked angry, yes. Some looked wounded in quiet ways no official report would ever capture. But no one looked shocked. It was as though humanity had carried, for generations, the grim knowledge that if the day ever came when the galaxy needed them fully, the galaxy would recoil the moment it understood what that need really meant. The debates inside human command were harsher. Tail had imagined, foolishly, that once humanity took strategic authority, its internal cohesion would become absolute. Instead, the more the pressure rose, the more openly their disagreements sharpened. One school, led by Admiral Vale, pushed for escalating disruption, deeper unpredictability, and the gradual collapse of the enemy's learning architecture. Another demanded containment and civilian preservation above all, arguing that if humanity won by becoming strategically indistinguishable from extinction itself, then the Union might survive materially while losing the trust required to remain civilization. A third position, colder than either, argued that the window for elegant solutions had already closed.
The enemy was learning human moral structure too quickly. Therefore, the only remaining path was to force its full concentration onto a target so valuable, so dense with prepared infrastructure, that it could not resist committing beyond recovery. When Tail finally understood what that target was, he forgot to breathe. It was not a Union capital, not the Hall of Accord, not even the ancient inner worlds the enemy seemed to crave. It was the hidden human logistics web itself, the silent lattice they had spent generations building beneath freight routes, colonial supply shells, disguised shipyards, dormant relay husks, and civilian traffic algorithms. The network that had allowed the shadow fleets to wake in coordinated force. The network that had been humanity's real shield long before any warship revealed itself. If they ignited it all at once, if they turned their concealed backbone into a burning corridor of irresistible signatures, the enemy would likely commit everything it had left to the feast. And then humanity could try to kill it there. "You would burn your own spine," Tail said before he realized he had spoken aloud. No one on the bridge mocked the question. No one softened it either. Director Voss turned toward him, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw exhaustion beneath her composure, old and heavy and very human. "If we do not," she said, "it will keep learning against the living." The bridge fell silent around that sentence. Outside the forward screens, Narrows still burned in broken light. Inside the command ring, orders began moving across channels too secure for Union archival clearance, and Tail understood with a cold certainty that humanity had reached the place its ancestors had always prepared for and always hoped never to see. To stop the thing in the dark, they were about to set fire to the survival architecture of their own future. And somewhere beyond the burning convergence, the enemy turned as if it had already smelled the sacrifice being offered. The order to ignite the hidden logistics spine did not go out as a speech, a declaration, or some grand final vow preserved for history. It moved through encrypted channels and clipped human syntax, acknowledged by thousands of ships, stations, freight shells, and dormant infrastructure nodes that had spent decades pretending to be harmless pieces of civilian expansion. Across the inner lattice of human space, disguises began to die. Cargo depots unsealed armored cores. Colonial relay hubs rerouted their power into weaponized signal arrays. Maintenance platforms folded open like metal flowers grown for war instead of industry. From the outside, it looked less like mobilization than revelation, as though entire layers of reality were peeling back to expose the harder machinery hidden underneath. To the Union observers still clinging to the hope that humanity might somehow save them without becoming exactly what the founders had feared, the sight carried a terrible clarity. None of this had been improvised. This possibility had been built into human civilization so deeply that even their peace had been engineered to transform. Supreme Archivist Tail stood at the rear of the Resolute Mercy's command ring and watched the strategic map turn incandescent with emerging routes. Every newly awakened node formed part of a widening corridor that reached away from Narrows like a trail of blood through the stars. The design was obvious once seen and horrifying because of it. Humanity was creating an irresistible target, not by faking weakness, but by exposing genuine value on a scale the enemy could not ignore. Fuel arteries, fabrication vaults, reserve dock clusters, data trunks, cold storage armories, civilian evacuation intersections, all of it brightening deliberately within the hostile intelligence's search depth. The thing they fought had learned to read human preference. Now humanity was showing it the richest concentration of preference it possessed. "It will come," said one of the tactical officers, not with hope, but with the certainty of an execution schedule. "Yes," Admiral Vale replied. "And this time it will come hungry enough to stop pretending caution is intelligence." That was the heart of the doctrine, Tail realized. Every prior battle had taught the enemy that humans could vary methods faster than it could stabilize against them. But variation alone was no longer sufficient. The hostile mind had started using human restraint as a predictive tool, locating the moral contours under the noise. So humanity had chosen the one escalation the founders of the old report had most feared. They would deliberately place something they truly could not afford to lose in reach of the enemy, not because they were careless with sacrifice, but because only authentic risk could bait an intelligence that now understood deception. The debate over that choice did not vanish simply because the order had been given. It grew sharper, more intimate, and for the first time since Tail had boarded the flagship, visibly painful. He saw captains argue over casualty bans with voices roughened by exhaustion, saw logistics officers go still when the projected burn list crossed civilian support nodes their own families had once used, saw analysts revise success models downward not because the enemy was stronger than expected, but because each new layer of truth stripped another comforting variable away. Human command was not unified by numbness. It was unified by endurance through disagreement. They fought one another fiercely because they intended to keep fighting the war honestly, and honesty had become savage. That savagery deepened when the enemy revealed its last survival trick. It happened first at the burning edge of the Narrows debris cloud, where a cluster of human pursuit craft had cornered what appeared to be a retreating fragment of dark mass against a collapsed shear boundary. The fragment split under fire exactly as predicted, and for 6 hopeful seconds every observer assumed the kill was clean. Then the supposed fragment burst outward into a spray of seed forms so small and dim that half the sensors lost them in the glare. They did not flee along ordinary escape vectors. They embedded themselves inside wreckage, signal ghosts, medical transports, and even drifting corpses still trapped in frozen breach suits. They were not escaping as a fleet anymore. They were escaping as a possibility. By the time the first full analysis reached the Resolute Mercy, the bridge temperature seemed to drop. "It has distributed continuity," Director Voss said. "Every major engagement was teaching us to look for concentration. That was the mask. Its persistence model is dispersal." Tail felt the meaning land like a physical blow. Even total battlefield victory would become meaningless if enough seeds slipped into the dark hidden inside debris, refugees, wrecks, and trade flow. The Union could win every visible fight and still die a century later from what survived unnoticed. Suddenly, the harsh human refusal to accept partial victory stopped feeling extreme and became the only rational response left in the galaxy. The enemy did not merely need to be beaten. It needed to be denied a future. As if in answer to that revelation, the final sealed section of the original anti-human report was released to command-level observers aboard the flagship. Tail read it standing beneath the tactical glow, his hands tightening on the data slate until the joints burned white. The founders had not feared human aggression in the vulgar sense the public always imagined. They had feared human closure instinct. Across every extreme simulation, every extinction model, every asymmetrical war exercise, humanity converged on the same psychological threshold. Once a threat crossed from rivalry into existential category, humans no longer optimized for victory, prestige, or even deterrence. They optimized for non-recurrence. They could tolerate staggering cost, cultural injury, reputational damage, and generational grief if those prices purchased one thing absolutely: the certainty that the same threat would never rise again to consume the living. That truth became impossible to ignore as the casualty memorial channels came online across the fleet. Human dead from Narrows, Kepri, Pelea Reach, and the burning pursuit zones were being read aloud in the transit intervals between combat directives. Not ceremonially, not for comfort, simply because the names would not be allowed to vanish inside numbers. Tail heard engineers reciting lost siblings while recalibrating weapon harmonics, drone coordinators whispering the names of friends over logistics traffic, a Marine lieutenant finishing a casualty list with a broken voice, and then returning immediately to boarding vector assignments. The Union had always imagined that such grief would cripple command efficiency. Instead, on human channels, grief moved beside function like a second bloodstream. It did not weaken the machine. It told the machine why it had the right to keep going. Then the final trust demand arrived. Every surviving Union command authority, every governor, fleet remnant, station council, and civil defense ministry received the same sealed instruction set from human strategic command. When the enemy committed to the ignited corridor, all non-human forces would withdraw beyond a defined threshold and relinquish local autonomy for the duration of the terminal operation. No interference. No emergency overrides. No heroic reentries. No symbolic last stands. The operation would require conditions so exact that even well-meaning intervention could fracture the kill architecture and guarantee escape seeding across the inner systems. The backlash was immediate and furious. Some called it madness. Some called it a coup concealed beneath necessity. Others, more frightened than angry, asked the question Tail knew mattered most and had not yet been answered. What exactly was the terminal operation? Human command did not tell them. Not because there was no answer, but because the answer itself was part of the trap, part of the weight that had to fall only once the enemy was fully committed and the galaxy had no path left but trust. Across the stars, the ignited human corridor brightened. Enemy vectors bent toward it from every direction. On the Resolute Mercy, final authorizations began to stack across Admiral Vale's command display like the closing teeth of some immense and irreversible mechanism. Then, with the whole Union holding its breath in fear, anger, awe, and desperate dependence, humanity opened the sealed launch codes for the operation its ancestors had hidden even from peace. And every light on the flagship turned red. When every light on the Resolute Mercy turned red, the noise of the bridge did not rise. It vanished. For one impossible heartbeat, the entire flagship seemed to inhale at once, and in that held breath Supreme Archivist Tail understood that humanity had crossed the final threshold the founders of the old report had feared. Not into rage, not into bloodlust, into commitment so complete that there was no room left for spectacle, only execution. Across the forward screens, the ignited logistics corridor blazed through the inner dark like an exposed nerve. Thousands of hidden human nodes, once disguised as commerce, transit, storage, or settlement support, now burned openly and irresistibly. The enemy came for it exactly as human command had predicted, no longer probing, no longer conserving, no longer pretending caution was intelligence. It surged from every approach vector in dense, hungry convergence, abandoning dispersal discipline in favor of total acquisition. For the first time since the war began, the devouring mind was not adapting to pressure. It was lunging at certainty. And that was when humanity locked the door behind it. The terminal operation was not a single weapon. It was a geometry of ending. Every ignited node in the corridor had spent decades hiding a second function beneath its civilian architecture, not a gun waiting for a battlefield, but part of a lattice designed to answer a question humanity had asked itself long before the galaxy knew its name. If an enemy could survive as fragments, how did one kill not the body, but the possibility of return? The answer now unfolded in ruthless precision. As the hostile mass drove deeper into the exposed corridor, the awakened nodes began emitting phased gravitic pulses so slight that no Union defense model would have flagged them as combat activity. On their own, they did almost nothing. Together, across the full spine of the lattice, they created a containment topology that bent momentum inward, spoiled escape vectors, and forced every active fragment, every hidden seed form, every infiltrated survival shard into a tightening field of mutual interference. The enemy reacted instantly, but for the first time its reaction arrived too late. It tried to split. The lattice made splitting heavier than staying whole. It tried to diffuse into wreckage and radiation. The corridor's phased fields made debris itself drag against it like tar. It tried to shed expendable mass and preserve core intelligence in smaller packets. Human hunter screens, already seeded through the corridor, lit the dark with so many layered search sweeps that nothing above dust scale remained invisible for more than seconds. The bridge displays became a storm of collapsing red signatures, each tagged, tracked, and denied a future. Fabrication vaults, reserve docks, freight shells, fuel arteries, relay trunks, cold depots, all of it transformed in sequence from infrastructure into annihilation architecture. The phased gravitic cage collapsed inward at the exact instant the burn wave ignited, not outward like an explosion, but inward like judgment. Matter, energy, fragments, seed forms, false corpses, infiltrated wreckage, every last survival path the enemy had prepared for itself was dragged toward the converging heart of the corridor and held there just long enough for the burn to pass through it. It was not beautiful. Tail would remember that forever. Civilizations too often lied about terrible things by calling them beautiful. What filled the screens was hideous in its scale and absolute in its purpose. A corridor of human future turned white-hot, and then black, a wound laid open through the stars to ensure something worse could never pass through them again. The enemy screamed only on the instruments. There was no sound in vacuum, but the sensor translations rendered its structural collapse as cascading distortions, as though a mind the size of sectors was being forced, at last, to understand a limit it had never accepted before. One by one, then by millions, the red signatures died. Some still tried to run. That was where the last human squadrons entered. Small pursuit groups, already waiting beyond the burn horizon, came through the ash of their own civilization's backbone and hunted what remained with a calm that chilled Tail more deeply than any roar could have done. No victory turns. No celebratory broadcasts. Just confirmation sweeps, breach teams, microburn sterilization passes, and repeated rechecks of every dead zone until even the most stubborn survival probability collapsed below meaning. Humanity did not stop when the enemy broke. Humanity stopped when return became impossible. The final confirmation took 9 hours. When it came, the bridge did not cheer. Some people closed their eyes. Some bowed their heads. One weapons officer sat down on the deck where he stood and covered his face with both hands. Director Voss looked at the casualty roll for a very long time before authorizing transmission to the Union, The hostile intelligence had been eliminated across all active vectors. No persistent seed signatures remained. The war, in the only sense humanity considered real, was over. Then the memorial channels opened across the surviving fleet, and the names began. They lasted through the voyage home. By the time the battered human armadas returned to the restored halls of Union space, entire species no longer knew how to meet them without shame. The elder powers offered everything they understood as reward: a permanent ruling seat, strategic primacy, revision of the old law into a founding apology, honors old enough to have shaped history. Humanity accepted none of it. Their surviving leaders arrived not in triumphal regalia, but in mourning black. When Chancellor Varys, voice unsteady with gratitude and humiliation, asked what humanity wished in return for saving the galaxy, Director Voss answered with a simplicity that left the chamber unable to breathe. "Build your peace," she said, "so it does not require someone like us to save it again." Later, when the old report was finally released in full to every world, the galaxy read the line its ancestors had buried in fear and called wisdom. Humanity was not forbidden from war because it loved violence more than others. Humanity was forbidden because, once forced to choose between the comfort of limits and the survival of the living, it would burn everything necessary to make sure the threat never rose again. From that day forward, the Union did what all wounded civilizations eventually do when truth arrives too late. It was memorable. It traded with humans, learned from humans, apologized to humans, and invited human strategists into academies that had once dismissed them as dangerous primitives. But somewhere beneath the respect, beneath the gratitude, beneath the fragile new honesty of peace, another feeling remained and never quite left. The galaxy slept because humanity had stayed awake. And now everyone finally understood why the old ban had been written in the first place.